Hey, welcome to another episode of Region Break, where we look at the differences between the US version and, in this case, the Japanese version of Super Mario RPG. The first, most striking, and most notorious change in this game, you may have heard of it, Bowser's victory stance had to be changed for the US version. Over in the US, he kind of pumps both his fists, which honestly is a great victory pose. You get a nice look at his face. But in Japan, he does the Bras d'Honneur, which in Japan, it's used to convey courage or determination, but in Brazil and Italy, for example, it can be a lot more offensive. Think about the worst hand gesture you could do in America, and it's equivalent to that. Another massive overhaul was the file select screen. I guess the font for the US version just was too crowded and too large to fit into these tiny boxes that were used for the Japanese version. So in order to avoid having to compose an all new font, the file select screen was reworked, which hides a bunch of details not seen in the US version, like this dial to the left over here, as well as these exhaust stacks. And in the opening intro sequence, the game does a sort of roll call. And while Super Mario and Mallow remain the same, Princess Peach is known as Princess Toadstool, and King Bowser is known as King Koopa. Peach and Koopa are names that are still used in Japan to this day, Koopa! Whereas in later games, the US finally conformed to Princess Peach. And yes, Geno's name is also the same in the intro sequence. However, Geno's quote-unquote real name, which is unpronounceable, was a series of existing symbols used throughout the game in the US version, but in the Japanese version, there's wingding-like images that are never used anywhere else in the game. So if you want to know what Geno's real name was, it's a Pokeball, some stink lines, an eyeball, and a scroll bar cursor. And then there's a secret code that is completely exclusive to the Japanese version. And when the player puts in this secret code, Toad shows up in the menu screen and says, "Secret code discovered." All right, so let's check your stats. Wow, nothing's changed. But what about your experience points? Nope, nothing's changed. And so there's no point in looking for other secret codes, and you'll always get the same result. But I'll play with you as much as you want. The end of secret code. This was likely some sort of debugging tool that was used by the developers and left in the game as sort of an Easter egg, and then just gutted entirely for the US version. And here's one that's a little uninteresting. In the US, they have a subtitle that says Legend of the Seven Stars. But in Japan, all it has underneath there is the title of the game written in Japanese, Super Mario RPG. So this one's pretty cool. The user interface for Super Mario RPG uses the controller pad to signify which buttons do what. In the US, we have a Super Nintendo controller that is only two tones. It's a dark purple and a light purple, whereas in Japan, it's multicolored. And so in order to compensate for that, the localizers really went for the trouble of changing all the colors of the user interface here, which is really cool. They even went the extra mile for future parts of the game, where a boss named Boyer deactivates certain moves that you would normally be able to do. And how about things that are not changed between the US and the Japanese version, which has caused some confusion amongst fans over the years? When you get onto the Royal Bus, it says JB on the bus itself. Now, why is that? Well, a character that has been talked about on this show specifically, Lakitu, has a different name over in Japan. It's Jugemu. If you want a full explanation behind the name Jugemu, I recommend you watch the Super Mario Kart episode after this video. But for now, all you need to know is that its name is Jugemu, and so the JB stands for Jugemu Bus. Why the Royal Bus wasn't cleverly changed to something that starts with J, or why the graphics of the Jugemu Bus couldn't be modified slightly, I don't know. Also, another weird thing is that Booster is known as Buki over in Japan, and you can see his Japanese name written out above this welcome sign, and that Japanese lettering was never changed for the US version, which makes for another interesting lack of change. And this enemy you should already know is a Sniffit, but in Super Mario RPG for the US, they call this particular variant Spookums, which is really strange because this variant has its Japanese equivalent name Mucho, which Mucho is the official Japanese name for Sniffit. Now, when you do the Psychopath ability, which allows you to read enemies' minds, in the US, it's thinking "Que pasa?" Now, you might be wondering, why is it speaking Spanish? Well, the Japanese developers are very aware of the fact that muchos sounds like a Spanish word, whereas in the Japanese version, it says "Como esta Española?" This nod to the Spanish-sounding names of the Muchos extends itself into later games as well. The latest example I can think of is Paper Mario and the Origami King, where you find them in a heavily Mexican-inspired environment. Now let's talk about some other common misconceptions that people have had. Over by this fireplace, you can find something of Princess Toadstools. Now, your imagination is allowed to wander wherever direction it wants to go, but people have made this mistake of saying that in the Japanese version, it's more explicit, as you can see 3 X's instead of 3 question marks. However, this does does indicate that in Japan, they're also unsure about what this means, just the same as it is in the US, and to clarify that confusion, it's localized to show the 3 question marks so that we don't jump to any insane conclusions. And over here in the US, we know Exor and everyone else as part of Smithy's gang. However, this sort of localization sort of misleads the US players as far as what the role is of Smithy and his army. If it was translated more literally from Japanese, Smithy gang would more so be like the Blacksmith King's army, or the Smith King army. And very briefly, I want to talk about the box differences between the 2 regions. And today's sponsor ties in really well with today's episode. It's Bai. And the reason why it ties in really well is because I picked up 2 items from them very recently. It was a Japanese copy of Super Mario RPG and also a mini player's guide that I thought had unique artwork, and then I found out of course it was used in other ways. But still, this is a really cool thing to just kind of display with my box set, and I definitely wouldn't have been able to get this mini player's guide without the help of Bai. So what do they do? Well, if you want to bid or buy from any Japanese auction sites like Yahoo Japan, you're going to need a third party to be able to convert your US dollars into yen, as well as ship that package internationally, because most Japanese sellers just ship domestically, which kind of makes sense since not many people outside Japan even speak Japanese. And collectors of obscure merchandise from video games really benefit from Bai, because back in the day, merchandising was a lot stronger in Japan than it was in the US. Anyways, if you're interested, there is a 10% off your first purchase. There's a link for that in the description, as well as the pinned comment. Thank you so much, Bai, for sponsoring this show. And with that, let's continue on. And now I briefly want to go over the physical aspects of the games, because you'll find that there's a really cool thing inside of these game manuals if you didn't know already. First thing I want to talk about is the box art for the Japanese version. If you end up picking up a physical version of the remake, you might find this to look very familiar. This is because the original box art in Japan just had a white background with some of the key characters, but also Yoshi for, I'm guessing, marketing reasons. And in the remake, they essentially replicate that, though interestingly, they put Geno in the front. I guess Geno has developed some marketing appeal over the years. Anyways, the game cartridge features just Mario, and the game manual has Luigi's only appearance in the game. I was a bit surprised by this, but Luigi does not have a 3D render, and instead uses key art from previous Mario games. I thought for sure this was just going to be a thing for the US manual only, considering the developers could easily make a render of Luigi if they wanted to, but no, it got its start here in Japan. And on the back, it has a blurb about the game, reading from right to left. It says, as usual, Princess Peach is kidnapped. As usual, Mario heads to Koopa Castle. But right before, there is something different. The first RPG in the series. The curtain of Mario's grand adventure opens. Now, with the way that it's worded, you would think that it's trying to hide the fact that Smithy is involved with this game. And you'd be right. Anyone might be able to recall that if you had no save files on your copy of Super Mario RPG, Exor, who's usually stabbed inside of Koopa Castle, is missing in both the title screen and with such dedication also in the game's intro cinematic. Now if we move over to the US side of things, they didn't do a really good job of hiding the fact that Exor is in Koopa's castle, now did they? Anybody who buys the game or even has the cartridge of the game can see Exor sitting right there, ruining the surprise. Although it should be stated that the Japanese box also kind of drops the ball here, showing Exor on the back of the box. And as you're going to see here, the Luigi gimmick of him talking about Mario and everything else is featured in the US manual as well. And on the back of the box of the US version, it says, an incredible new adventure where mystery and mayhem rule. Mario returns in this new role-playing adventure. His latest rival is Smithy, a menacing creature who causes fear and treachery in the Mushroom Kingdom. Mario must recover the 7 stars and repair the Star Road before he can make his way to Bowser Castle for a final confrontation with Smithy. Powerful weapons, sinister spells, and other useful items help Mario complete his harrowing journey. New friends and old allies support him along the way. Even Bowser lends a hand. The back of this box is not shy at all about trying to tell you that Bowser is not the lead enemy of this game. The plot twist that is supposed to be at the very start is completely absent in all the marketing material on this box. Alright, now this is the part of the video where we get into Ted Woolsey's localization. As I go through this, just remember that localization is different from literally translating a script. And so now we're going to look at some stuff that's just strikingly different from one another. Like this scene right here, this boy is frozen, and in the US, he says, I want to go someplace fun. Standing around here is so boring. Whereas over on the right, he talks about peeing his pants. This snippet here says, please refrain from bothering Booster. Whereas in Japan, it says, please refrain from chasing Buki-sama's butt. And this one's really cool. This character right here has a whole arc of being obsessed with jumping, sort of in a fangirl-like way, and it can be up to you to decide whether or not Ted Woolsey did something more interesting with it. Over in the US, when you stop here, this character says, hey Mario, look what you're standing in, and then you jump, and she goes, ha, gotcha. In Japan, she says, hi Mario, show me your special jump. And then she says, oh, that's so cool. And you'll see that there's a heart at the end of this dialogue to sort of represent the fangirliness. And here's where it really starts to get lost in translation. Her obsession with jumping continues in Japanese, whereas in the US, you'll see that it plays out a lot differently. In the US, she says, I don't know what that reptile is up to, but man, can he jump. Whereas in Japan, she says, what was up with that crocodile? But he's so good at jumping. And then here she says, Mario, let's see how you're going to take care of Bowser. But over in Japan, the jumping gimmick is continued, where she says, Mario, I want to see your special jump again. After you jump, she says in the US, wow, he doesn't stand a chance. Whereas in Japan, she says, wow, you're gonna beat him with that? So cool. And here's one of my favorite lines from the game, only to find out it's really different in Japan. And it'll definitely break my heart if it's not in the remake. When Krako runs by this Toad, you can talk to him, and Mallow will ask him why he didn't stop him. In the US, Toad says, because I forgot my bazooka at home. Sheesh, give me a break here, followed by a comedic fall. But the dialogue in Japanese is way more bland, where he just states, I'm just a lookout. Another famous Ted Woolsey line is the Bruce Lee moment. Yes, you heard me right, I said Bruce Lee, where Mario's about to fight the boss and Mallow says, who do you think you are, Bruce Lee? You can't just go in there with your fist flying. In the Japanese version, he just says, whoa, wait a minute. Another movie reference here, where in the US version it says, I'm shaken but not stirred. In Japanese, he says, I'm afraid but I'll keep watch. In the Mary Moore Deluxe Suite, there's a bathrobe over on the wall. In the US, it's just very plainly stated it's too small for you. Whereas in Japan, it gets a little more specific. It says that it's mushroom-sized. And one of Luigi's 2 in-game cameos is here on Star Road, and surprisingly, the dialogue between these two are very different. They both indicate that it's Luigi, with the US version saying, I want to be a great plumber like my brother Mario. In Japanese, it might be a little hard to tell that it's Luigi, with the dialogue only translating to, I want to help my big brother. And this one's pretty amazing. So there's this password you gotta put in before you meet Johnny. And you can uncover a series of hints all throughout this area to figure out that in the US version, the password is pearls. Now, how does this work in the Japanese version? Well, amazingly, the password in the original Japanese version uses the same exact amount of characters, and the correct character is in the same exact slots as the US version. And that means you can play both games side by side and get the correct password by moving Mario identically to one another in each version. However, the password is not pearls. The answer in the Japanese version is aquarium, specifically the businesses that you would go and visit. And then the battle with Culex is insanely different. I remember distinctly all the dialogue in the US version giving a real sense of mystique to the